there, my name's Audrey Melnik and I'm here to talk to you today about how to increase your SaaS trial conversions without developer involvement. If you're familiar with the product-led growth approach, being able to experiment is key to getting your users to their aha moment. You may already have your own experimentation process or framework. This is one that I've devised that makes sense to me. But before we can move forward with our experiments, we need to get real on where we're at and what might be holding us back from this experimentation nirvana. There's one role in a startup that is constantly a bottleneck for forward movement, and that's the role of the software developer. It's not because they're bad at their job, but because they have way too much to do. So any new task that comes up needs to be reviewed in light of this backlog and prioritized accordingly. Back when I was designing and building software for corporates who had plenty of time and money to throw at this, fast forward to today, in our efforts to move fast for our startups, we've reverted back to engulfing our business logic into code. The irony is that in doing so, we're actually slowing down the velocity of our startup because once again, we're relying on the developer to make any changes to our business rules. So how can we put this business logic back in the hands of our business people so they can make changes to them using modern methods? In analytics, yes, we want to track a lot, but we want to do it with the right granularity and we want to capture the full customer journey, not just the parts the developer has dominion over. And we want the right information to be available at the right time in case we may want to segment on a specific attribute. At the other end of the spectrum, I'm often amazed when I work with clients at just how little they're tracking. Both of these scenarios can amount to the same problem. Paralysis. Paralysis from too much data or paralysis from not enough data. And what's more, most companies don't activate the data that they have. Nowadays, the ever-expanding technology landscape, it's the complexity of capturing this journey and knitting it together across devices and sessions and tools is really non-trivial. So how can we use the experiment process without falling into these same problems? Well, that's where customer journey optimization comes in. Customer journey optimization reduces the cost to acquire and retain a customer and increases lifetime value, but without developer involvement. The customer journey optimization methodology comprises these 5 key components: the customer funnel, fit-for-purpose tools, the complete view of the customer, playbooks, and principles. Let's start with the principles. So what we want to do is connect our fit-for-purpose tools together and integrate them by segment. And what we want to do is basically, when someone is using your app, we want to send data into Segment about who they are and what they're doing. And then Segment will be able to publish that information out to all the other tools in your ecosystem. So I've covered off principle number 2. Now, number 3 is all about making these components replaceable. So let's say we're using Help Scout as our help desk and we want to replace that with Zendesk. We want to be able to do that without having to get a whole lot of effort from the developer to make this change. And with this architecture where things are hub and spoke, you're able to do that pretty easily without having to get the developer involved. Business rules should be changeable by the business and not live in code. Number 5, we want to be able to experiment and iterate with guiding content. And by that I mean, those in-app walkthroughs and pop-ups and tooltips and all of those kinds of things. You're never going to get that right on day one. And if you use custom-built software to implement those, then you're actually, once again, tying yourself way too closely to the developer and their bottleneck. Number 6, don't distract the developer. I think you've kind of gotten the gist by now, but really the developer should be focusing on building the core product, not on converting the customer. And lastly, the last principle is all about being able to experiment with pricing plans because your pricing is never going to be right on day one and it's going to evolve as your product evolves. So you want to have a framework that enables you to make some changes and experiment on that pricing. Every interaction we have with the customer, every interaction the systems we use have with the customer and all the relevant attributes of a customer make up this complete view of a customer. These interactions and attributes have a number of sources. Our customer funnel is an 8-stage funnel that applies to any SaaS business. Its power is that it provides a framework and a common vocabulary for discussing what needs to be done. Each of these stages has a goal and a set of tools and playbooks we can apply to them. For this talk, we're focusing on the trial phase and getting the user to convert to a paying customer. The final piece in our puzzle is playbooks. Playbooks bring together all of the other pieces in our customer journey optimization toolkit together. The tools, the principles, the complete view of the customer, and the customer funnel. A playbook maps out the interactions and events and how these pieces of information flow between tools and trigger various actions. For the trial phase, we have these playbooks: trial sign-up playbook, the initial value playbook, the trial extension and expiry playbook, the activation playbook, and the land and expand playbook. A key trial concept I want to discuss is the concept of initial value. When you get to that point where you experience the value that relates to your preconceived notion, that's what's called initial value. Getting to initial value requires being on point with 3 key factors. When a user first signs up to your product, they have curiosity. They must have enough curiosity to see them through the onboarding process to get to initial value. They come to your product with a preconception about the value they think your product provides, based on the marketing messages they've seen. And they hopefully have a relevant problem that needs solving, one that your tool can help solve. You must get all 3 right to get to initial value and ultimately activation. If they have curiosity and a preconception, but no problem to solve, they'll walk away from a tool thinking it's cool but not needing to add their payment details. If they have a problem and a preconception, but their curiosity runs out before they get to initial value, they won't be a converting customer. If they have a problem and the requisite amount of curiosity, but your solution fails to match their preconception of what your product does, you'll lose their trust and their business. When you're crafting your onboarding process, you need to keep all of these factors in mind. It will help you craft the language you present to your user to keep them on track and to help them get to that point of initial value. Let's talk about what it takes to go from curiosity to initial value. Your user isn't going to see the value of your product without going through some key steps first. What those key steps are will differ for each product. You most likely won't know right now what those steps comprise definitively, but you will have a hypothesis about what they are. That set of steps got to go from curiosity to initial value is called the initial value ladder. It's important to note that not all onboarding journeys are created equally. The path from signing up for a trial to getting to initial value has 2 key components: the curiosity component and the setup component. In the curiosity steps, your user will be clicking around and will be looking to validate their preconception about whether your tool can solve their problem. They haven't yet decided to commit to setting up your tool for their needs. In a B2B environment, we often have multi-user SaaS products. The first user from the account is called first user, and then other users from the same account are called subsequent users or invited users. Their onboarding journeys are often different, and that usually means that the subsequent users don't have a setup component to their trial experience. One thing you should consider is that because the subsequent user often doesn't view the landing page marketing copy, you'll need to introduce them to the product benefits from within the product and in your automation messages. And when you set up your onboarding experience, you absolutely need to tailor the experience differently between these 2 roles. Also, what you'll notice from this diagram is that different SaaS tools can take different approaches to getting the user to their aha moment. If it's the kind of tool that requires a lot of setup, then in order to extend the user's curiosity period, you may need to leverage demo data to illustrate what they can achieve with your tool. So think about which path your tool takes and whether you can get your users to initial value before their curiosity runs out. If your tool takes a lot of setup, then you may want to switch to populating demo data on sign up so you can extend their curiosity runway. The last step of each of these paths is engagement, which leads to activation, where the user decides to turn into a paying customer. A value gap represents the chasm between perceived value and experienced value. A value gap can happen for many reasons, but here are some of the big ones. Number 1, the product fails to provide adequate value. Number 2, the prospect is the wrong fit for the product. Number 3, the prospect doesn't understand the product's capabilities or how to use it. Or number 4, the prospect experiences something jarring or painful, like confusion, dissatisfaction, etc., that changes their perception while using the product. So how do we bridge this value gap? One way is to make changes to the product, but that's usually a rather long life cycle, as we know. So the other way is to use what we call bump events. Wes Bush, the author of the Product-Led Growth book, came up with this concept of the bowling alley framework. To get the user from the current state to the desired outcome, we install bumper bars like we would in bumper bowling that pushes the prospect back on course. The two types of bumpers are conversational bumpers and product bumpers. So any event that's triggered from these bumpers is what I call a bump event. And the best part of these bump events is that you don't need to get a developer to implement them, as long as you follow my framework. Some of the events that we define for our customer journey can be classified as signal events. These events are events that happen often and can give us signals into what's happening for the user. So the three types of signal events are promising, concerning, and activation signals. We use promising signals to identify the user's potential in reaching initial value. We use concerning signals to identify when the user may be struggling to reach initial value. And we use activation signals to identify a user's potential in reaching activation. But signals aren't things that we act on after one signal event happens. Instead, when we detect a series of these events, we can adjust the customer's journey or even flag that activation as having been achieved. You may remember Facebook declaring that activation was reached for their new users after they added 7 friends. At some point, you'll come across or you'll come up with your own similar hypothesis for your product. So while initial value gets them to that first step where they see a tangible benefit, activation is the point that they see enough value to commit. They've been dating up to now, and activation is when they accept your proposal of marriage. So make sure your promises match your delivery. If the promise of your product was productivity, your activation point should be related to them by being able to maximize achievement. If the promise of your product was simplicity, your activation point should be related to how soon they were able to achieve their goal. If the promise of your product was collaboration, your activation point should have realized a clear path to connection. Also, keep in mind that while the path to initial value is often a sequence of specific events that we can define in an initial value ladder, the path to activation is often more nebulous and is usually a result of a frequent occurrence of one or more specific events. So you'll probably get to a true understanding of activation after you've converted a decent amount of customers and have been able to analyze what these customers have in common. I want to take a few moments to walk through the optimal way to implement your tracking. In the plan phase, we define the identify calls and track events we're going to send for each scenario. We'll map out that data and think through how that impacts on our playbook, how that data shows up in our destination tools, and what we want to do with that data in those destination tools. I think this is a super important step because we're not just tracking for the sake of tracking. We're tracking to either understand through analytics or activate through some automation of the customer's journey. Think about the events we've defined as bump events and signal events. We build automation journeys based on those events happening, either straight away or based on the counts of those events happening. Sometimes we use the information from those events in messaging we present to the user. When I do this design step, I'm not just thinking about what I need right now, but also what I might want in the future. We want to be really discerning about how much we do here, but there are certain attributes that might be great for some future analytics. For example, adding an attribute on an activation event to tell us how many days into trial they are or how many days they are from their trial ending. In the simulate phase, this is where we set up the tools with our playbooks and start simulating the customer journey to flesh out our destination tools so we can see if there are any gaps in our tracking plan that we set up in the plan phase and to make sure our automations are set up right. The benefit of this is that before we even go to our developer with a tracking plan to get them to implement it in the code base, we're doing our own testing, which will expose more requirements for what we want to capture about the customer journey. So when we do finally go to our developer to implement the tracking plan, we can then be more assured that we won't have to go back to them a bunch more times to make further changes. The final step is the implement and launch phase, which is where we get the developer to implement the calls and flip everything over to the production environment rather than it all being in the staging or testing environment.